do have a couple videos that'll go through just to explain it, but this outside zone concept and probably the reason why I've been asked to present this is a pretty unique one. And it was taught to me by my offensive line coach, Chris Colson, at the University of Ottawa. He later brought the same concept over to Carleton University while he was there. And the concept is unique in the sense that I don't think it's something you could run south of the border. It's really important that you have that 1 yard neutral zone gap. If you don't have it, it's difficult to get the amount of depth into our backfield and space between defensive linemen and offensive linemen to run it effectively. And what I've noticed, having run it, as a player and then coaching at the university level and then coaching at high school, the higher the level of play, very different the blocking scheme actually turns out to be. And you'll see a little bit about what I'm talking about later in some of the clips I have. But what's the focus mainly of what I'm going to talk about here? First is blocking scheme, and the blocking scheme that I use to refer to is the rail. Okay, the rail scheme for outside zone. You've probably heard, and of course there's different ways to skin a cat, but you've probably heard of all reaches, or you've heard of scoop and climb. All of those are great cuts backside. But I found, especially at the high school level, running the rail really exposes a team that has, I don't want to say a lazy contained player, but a high school level contained player where it's not always easiest for them to hold that contain, especially if you have a really aggressive, fast offensive line. The next part is steps. You'll see a little video with some of my helpers in it, and steps for offensive linemen and then steps for the running back. Both of those things put them on a rail that'll take them along their path with their blocking scheme. And finally, what's the goal of this? Okay, why are we running outside zone? What's the purpose of running it in this particular way? You'll see that at the end. So this is just a quick drop. This is going strong. This is going weak as well. The reason I draw it strong and weak, we often, and I know some people probably run this as well, but you probably heard left and right tackles, left and right guards, and center. We often refer to them as field guard, field tackle, boundary guard, and boundary tackle because they play strong and weak. And the reason for that, there are quite a few reasons, but it could be based on the play set of a defensive player. Right, wanted to make sure that you have your best offensive lineman playing against the best defensive lineman. Usually, maybe you got a big, strong, quick end that's coming up against an offensive lineman. You want to have someone that matches up well. Defenses don't line based on left and right. They align by strong and weak. So that's what we do. And it also helps us in our blocking scheme. And it also helps us in practice in developing the efficiencies for running this rail blocking scheme against a team that, let's say, runs 75% strong 40. Okay, so if we know that they're constantly coming out, especially on 1st and 10 in a strong 40, and we like our chances at being able to get our rail past the weak side defensive end and passing the nose past the center or even backside guard, we're going to run to the weak side. Okay, so it all comes down to efficiencies, and this is essentially how we draw it up. Now, this is in 2-back. It could be run in 1-back as well. It could be run from gun. It could be run from trigger. It could be run from under. I think the biggest challenge that you face when you're changing up, your quarterback position and the snap is it makes the job of the center a little bit more difficult if you're in gun or trigger. Okay, it's a pretty unique step. It requires a lot of speed, a lot of athleticism, and it's asking a lot of an offensive lineman. So we really ask them to cheat a bit. They do have to lean their bodies. They do have to load a leg. We'll see that a little bit later. But essentially, I've always preferred running it from under. It secures the snap. And it gives some pretty good angles for a fullback and our tailback. Your fullback is essentially going to play up to the line like a tight end. You can start with him staggered off of the line. You can put him in an I formation. He can sing or whiz up to the play side of the line. He is going to be the front man in the rail. Okay, and the rail concept is going to join all of these offensive linemen in the tightest formation that we could possibly get, and they're going to be parallel to the line of scrimmage, and their eyes, by the third step, is going to be facing the sideline. And the reason for that is our goal is to teach them to ignore all of these players we see here. Okay, almost similar to slide protection, where players are trying to pass off players to their backside gap. This is the job of offensive linemen and any player that's playing in the rail. It could be a tight end or a fullback. Their job is to cover the play side gap in front of them. Once they get into the rail, they have to make sure that the gap in front of them doesn't widen to the point that it could be knifed or stopped by a defensive player. How do they do that? Well, they have to be able to cover their front side buddies backside. Okay, so they have to be able to get to the jersey of the player they're pursuing. Okay. Once players get into this rail scheme, the ideal goal in an ideal world would be the entire rail is able to run and turn north on the perimeter player or the contained player on the defense. Okay, so in this case, we'll say it's the rush. If that player gets passed up by the first player in the rail, the chances of us being able to pass the center around that first contained player is pretty high. Okay, it almost turns into a bit of a tumble dry, and they keep kind of rolling down, because if this player set it up the right way, everyone else should be right in behind, and there's no gaps for that rush to penetrate. If we can do that and we go north, we're also able to stop the linebackers flowing over top. Okay, we do create a lot of lateral movement. They're going to read in our backfield. They're going to see that it's an outside perimeter play, especially by the hats on our offensive linemen popping out and stepping that way. So this guy's flying like a bat out of hell. I don't often do this, but we have used a crack block to the second level linebacker play side. It makes it a little bit more of a point of attack play at that point, but the same concept is applied with the blocking scheme and the running back. When it comes to the running back, I'll talk about their steps in a little bit, but probably the next most difficult aspect of this play, outside of all the offensive linemen being as tight as possible, is the mesh point. Okay, so the quarterback being able to get the ball to the running back becomes infinitely easier as we move back to trigger or even into gun, but it's a very tough job for the quarterback, especially when he's in under. Okay, so with every play, there's always drawbacks, and one of them here is if you go to gun, it's tougher on your center. If you go to under, it's tougher on your quarterback. So which one's the better athlete, and who can you rely on not to make the worst of a bad situation? I often teach this to our offensive line with rules. Okay, so I show them the play on paper, but I prefer creating rules because they don't have the paper on the field in the game. And it's probably because that's how I learned best. And I think that's what was taught to me from coaches before. But we call them chance rules, things that they can just be running through their head as they're approaching the line of scrimmage, as they're talking to their line mates. At the end of the day, we want them to be able to remember the play and its concepts more so than the lines are drawn on the paper, because once the ball is snapped, those lines are all gone. The first thing an offensive lineman is going to do on outside zone as they're approaching the line of scrimmage, they're going to get into their stance, whether it's a 3-point or a 2-point stance. They're going to load their opposite leg. Okay, so if they're stepping to their right, okay, they're going to load their left leg. Sometimes, especially with high school players, it almost looks like they're leaning. I don't teach that. I say about 90% of your body weight is in that opposite leg. If they're leaning, it's not a big deal. You want to train them to get away from that, but a lot of people are concerned, oh, this might give it away. It's not, because in this instance, you're leaning opposite the direction of where you're actually going. The next part is after you're taking your first step, and you'll see what the steps look like in the videos, you're trying to give ground to gain leverage. It's hard to teach this concept, especially since a lot of high school teams are probably running a point of attack. I mean, you might mix it up a little bit, but at the same time, most run plays are asking them to step forward. Okay, we're asking them to step backwards on the first play. It's not a bucket step, it's a step with meaning. They're exploding from their one leg to their other. It's almost like a jump on a 45-degree angle, opening up their hips to turn their body and get as far back into their backfield in the direction that we're running the play as possible. Okay, why do we give ground to gain? Why do we give ground? It's to gain leverage. Okay, the further back we get into our backfield and that 1 year gap, and that's why I think this is very specific to Canadian football. The further back we are, the better a chance we have of being able to outrun a defender who's trying to protect their outside shoulder and contain our offense. Okay, so if we got an offensive lineman who runs, let's say, a 6'2" 40, which would be pretty good for some high school offensive lineman or me, and you got a defensive lineman who runs a 4'8", that's kind of an impossible ask. So how do we do that? Well, we give them a bit of leverage. The further back into our backfield you are on this play, the faster you actually become. Then the next thing in their head should be cover my buddy. I have to run the rail, and running the rail becomes a sprint. One of the trickiest aspects of teaching this to offensive linemen is to get them to stop staring at the defensive side of the ball once they've made their step and they're in the rail. Now it's a track meet. Now you are on full speed sprint to get your belly and your chest to the back of the player in front of you. Okay, and it kind of looks like Keystone Cops and everyone's bumping into each other. If that happens, that's great. It never really happens that way, but if it happens and it happens naturally, it means all gaps are covered and likely you've gone around the horn. The next aspect of it is Cascade or Waterfall. Okay, and we teach this to offensive linemen for every player that's in the rail sequentially. So if I go to the front side rail person, so the fullback, or if we're in one back play side tackle, if I go to that player and I say, you're going to set the rail, and they've set the rail, and they're about 1.5 yards in our backfield off of their step, and they're running their rail after their third step. The next player after should be deeper in our backfield, and we use the alignment of the V of the neck. So I always teach this: the V of the helmet is either side of the head of the player that you're blocking. So your helmet should be on the V of the neck closest to our backfield. And if we get players like that, the next player and the next player and the next player, the whole rail will start to bow backwards, and it gives us more leverage because the player who just got passed up on the defensive side to the backside gap is now tumble drying, just like I said, and he's going all the way down those gaps. And we actually have a chance to turn an entire offensive line outside the contained player on a defense. It doesn't always happen that way, but that's the goal. Be an athlete. And we ask this of our offensive linemen, especially in zone concepts. We need offensive linemen to be fast and athletic. And I say athletic specifically because they need to be able to move laterally. They need to be able to twist their body. They need to be able to bring force in a compromised position. And that's what this play really does to offensive linemen. It does compromise them for the first 3 steps. If you have a player who's trying to get around the horn, they're trying to pass up a player and get them backside, one of the techniques we teach, and we teach it to centers, is to rip through to second level. So your inside arm that's parallel to the line of scrimmage, as a defender is coming up, if you're not able to get outside and you're trying to push off of them with your arm like this, dip and rip, just like a defensive lineman would do to any of us, okay, on the offensive line side of the ball. And then finally, finish. Okay, what happens in the not so perfect world where we're not able to pass 5 offensive linemen outside the play side end? Well, in the case of a player who's penetrating a gap, it's all sequential. So let's say the play side tackle is able to get outside the rush, the play side guard isn't, and the rush knifes through that gap. Well, now he's on the tracks. We got to get him off them. Okay, so we got to get him off the rail. How do we get him off the rail? It's a 45-degree angle upfield shot put. Okay, so he's on on our rail. Rather than just pushing him along our rail, which will totally destroy our outside zone scheme, I'm going to get my hand under his shoulder pad, his armpit. I'm going to shot put him on a 45-degree angle into our backfield with vigor and to the sideline. Displacing him is the biggest thing we could do. It's clearing a body out of the way. It gives a chance for our running back to now cut and make a play off of that block. And it gives the player behind us in the rail a chance to now climb second level, because chances are the player that just penetrated was the last player that could penetrate into the gaps, and we're going to climb. Just take a look at what some of the other positions are doing. Receivers, stocks. Okay, so we're not sealing anyone off. It's a 2-way go for our running back. Ideally, we want to get our running back out into space, out into green space where they're going to have a chance to be an athlete, make a play. If receivers are all giving stocks and the 2-way go, so they got their hands on the breastplate, they're blocking, they're not pushing the defender any which way, they're trying to drive them straight back. It gives our running back a chance to make 2 decisions when they're cutting and reading receiver blocks. I have used cracks before, like I said. If you're really trying to target the perimeter, you can crack second level. There's success with that. The only problem with that is now you're going to leave a defensive back unblocked, and you're asking your front side rail person to kind of give up on that rail once they've turned the corner. And it is a bit of a mismatch, right? You might have a fullback or a tackle blocking a corner, which can be a lot of fun from the sidelines, but it can be a difficult task on the field. And the backside receivers could be running Sally routes. All of my offensive plays in this scheme that were taught to me in university have backside routes, and the quarterback is going to give that Sally action in the backfield. The running back, what's the running back do aside from run the ball? It's a jump pivot. So on the snap of the ball, they're going to jump pivot in the direction of the play call. So if we're going to the field side, they jump pivot to the field side, and their aiming point on that jump pivot is going to be 5 yards outside the original tackle. Okay, so before the tackle move, they're looking at where the 5-yard marker would be. Their jump pivot puts them there, and once they're in that position, their eyes are locked there, and they're staying on that rail, their own rail, and running as fast as they can. Now the quarterback has to get the ball to them. It can be a bit tricky. Okay, and the running back, the worst thing that can happen on this play in the backfield between the quarterback and the running back is the running back getting off of his rail to come back to the ball to get the ball. If the quarterback cannot get the ball to him, get a new quarterback or get faster or change up your alignment, right? You can go to gun or trigger. but practice makes perfect. It eventually gets there. It doesn't look pretty the first few, but once a quarterback and running back have been through a few mesh drills, it usually works out. What are some of the challenges that you face? I said before, at the university level or CFL, any level that runs this blocking scheme, and I'll go back even further. I think Chris Colson, my old O-line coach, learned this from Connie Kauai, who was the Renegades O-line coach back in the mid 2000s. I think the higher up you get, players aren't going to be tricked that easily. They're not going to give up contain. If a defensive end is the contain player and they know that they have to hold that perimeter, they're not going to be beaten so easily. At the high school level, sometimes you're able to trick a player into following the path of least resistance, and that's sometimes why I've used the crack in the past. But a contain player that does their job, if they do it effectively, they can kind of throw this play off. Now, there is a way to overcome that, right? It's the shot put. Okay, we put that player off of the rail, and there's a new rail with shorter players and a lot more space. Okay, but if they're able to hold their ground and not be shot put it upfield, it can be difficult to play against. Schemes and fronts that target outside zone. We've gotten away from outside zone on our team at St. Joe's probably the last 2 years, and that goes back to what Steve was saying at the beginning of the presentation. It's based on the athletes that you have. We had a track athlete who went to OHSF, who was a running back about 5-6 years ago. And we had an offensive line that had been together since junior, and they've been running rail pretty regularly. So we really had some success with it. That's changed over the past few years. We don't have the same athletic personnel that we had then. It's a bit different. We're still working on that, but we got away from that outside zone. But when we did run outside zone effectively, the teams that were able to kind of limit that would essentially put 2 on the outside. Okay, one of the fronts that we would have seen would have been a tiger front or a 3-man front with jetted linebackers. Okay, double jetted linebackers. That takes away the exterior. It does open up a defense to the interior, but at the same time, that is a pretty effective way of aligning your players to execute and stopping an effective outside zone rail scheme. The mesh point. Okay, you got to practice this pretty often. I would say every single day we're doing at least 10 minutes of mesh drill, especially at the beginning of the season. And with this outside zone, they need to get that mesh point down almost to a science that they can do it in their sleep. Effective knifing by an interior D lineman, a well-coached defensive lineman who's able to recognize this rail and see that the only way to stop it is to penetrate the gap. And that's really what the interior defensive linemen are trying to do anyways, is move with the gap as opposed to the player. If they're able to get upfield and knife, and I say knife, the defensive version of cutting or subbing, if they can get into that gap and cut down the next lineman in that sequence, again, it looks like that Keystone Cops, but for a bad reason, and they create a pile. Now you got a chance for a linebacker to flow downhill and make the tackle. And then varying athleticism. If you have some faster offensive linemen, they kind of ruin it for the regular offensive linemen. And so on and so forth. So a lot of repetition with the offensive line, letting them get a feel for their players that they're going to be running behind and what they need to do to get there. And the goal ultimately, when it comes to outside zone, and this is why you can choose whatever blocking scheme you'd like, but the goal is pretty much the same. If the defense is willing to sacrifice the perimeter, you got to take it and climb the ladder. Okay, if a defense is ever going to give you more green space to let your athlete go out into the open and kind of make a play, you're going to take that all day. If not, if a defense is really good at holding their own and holding that island and not letting you take the perimeter, you've effectively stretched out an inside zone play from 1 hash to the opposite numbers. Okay, so now you've given your running back a chance to make a read, and you've given them more space in those reads, and you're essentially utilizing lateral movement to create those vertical tears in the run game. And that's what I love about zone, whether it be inside zone or outside zone. There's no set hole. Okay, things happen on any given play. Now you're given a chance to all your players to do their best, and some might fail and some might succeed, but somewhere along the line, there's going to be a vertical tear for your running back to try and push it. Okay, so I'll take you some of the clips here. Stop share. Let's see. Peter, you jump on the mic and let me know if it's laggy or anything like that.
Hey coaches, a lot easier to show this on video, so I'm just going to do it right now, video-wise. I'm going to take a few steps for outside zone using the rail technique that I was talking about earlier. Essentially, your first step is always going to give ground to gain leverage. So that's the chant of the mantra that we talked about before. Your second step seems very against what we typically teach an offensive lineman, but it's a crossover step that's meant to get even more depth into your own backfield. Then your third step is essentially putting you on the rail. Okay, and then it's a bit of a track lead for offensive linemen. So we'll take you through those steps right now. For a 3-point stance, we tell the lineman to load their leg as much as possible. So you always want to load your opposite leg. It doesn't mean that you have to lean in your stance, okay? And if that does happen, it's not a big deal because it is a zone concept. But we're loading that leg on the inside. Oh, there's the defensive lineman trying to come after me. We're going to load that inside leg. That happened the whole time. We're going to load that inside leg. Basically put about 95% of our weight on it. Hand comes down on the snap of the ball. Our play side foot is going to jump back with that loaded leg. We're opening up our hips. We're now trying to get as far back into the backfield as possible. Okay. The second step is going to give us our hands. Okay. So as we're about to go into the crossover, this hand is reaching for our buddy's back. Okay. This hand is up to protect ourselves. Okay. The second step is getting depth into our own backfield, and now we're onto a crossover. Okay. Once we get into that second step, and we're put our offensive line in that position where they're now in this position. Okay, it seems very wobbly, but remember, we're giving up ground to gain leverage. We shouldn't be making contact. Our hand is up to protect ourselves. Our hand is there. Our head should now turn to our buddy's backside, and our job is to now cover the gap between the play side player in front of us and ourselves. Okay, trying to make sure that nothing can knife in between us and our buddy, our front side buddy. Okay, chasing them and getting them all the way to the sideline is essentially the toughest task with offensive linemen. We'll talk about it more. But again, first step, second step, and then a sprint. Okay, first step, boom. Second step, hand is up to protect yourself, crossover, and then it's a track meet with our offensive lineman now facing our player's backside. And that's what it looks like with the dog as a defensive lineman. Thank you.
Right. Get back into that screen. Bear with me, sorry. New share, that's what I needed.
That's great.
Okay, so that's just essentially the steps that you see there. I do have some game clips here, but I'm realizing we're kind of running low on time and I don't want to take too much time away. I do have clips in that slideshow that are time-stamped to the YouTube version, so you can see it kind of in action. They're all from the high school level, so you kind of see that you can get the perimeter and get quite a few offensive linemen to go north around that corner. Just in the interest of time, probably best to throw it to questions if you want to, Peter.